Hey there, it's Jason here from AVPro Edge, and in this video today we're going to talk a little bit about a brand new product, and that is the DeARC-KIT. This kit is designed for installations where primarily the TV or the display is used as the video source, such as using your favorite streaming apps within the TV. And one of the big challenges we've always run into is how do we get the audio from those internal apps back to the rack, back to the distributed system, and that's exactly what this DeARC-KIT is going to allow you to do. Let's take a look at some of the main features of the kit. First of all, you can take the eARC or ARC audio signal from the display and you can extend it up to 300 feet. This means you can send the audio to a soundbar, to an AVR, or through a distributed audio system. The kit also gives you the ability to take an analog or a digital source via analog stereo or mini toslink and turn that into an eARC stream. What's great about that is not only do you have the audio coming from the ARC or the eARC in the TV, if you have a local audio source, you can also put that into the system. With AP-Link, which is our own proprietary technology, all of those high-quality audio codecs that we love, including all the high bitrate codecs, gives you the same performance as if all the hardware was in the same room. Now, since the transmitter will be located at the display, you can select an ARC, an eARC, or an analog input on the kit. And with the HDMI output, you can send audio signals to a soundbar or a local AVR. If the display has an optical out or a left and right analog out, you can now send those audio signals through a distributed audio system. With the analog and toslink inputs and outputs, you now have options to send audio to a soundbar, an AVR, or even a set of wireless headphones. Or again, we can send audio through a distributed audio system. Depending on the TV, you may have to go into the audio output menu and do some configuration before it outputs the signal you'd like. Another great feature is bi-directional IR and RS-232. This will allow you to send control signals so you can control those components. To power the kit, you can use the supplied 12-volt power supply, or the kit supports POC, or power over cable. Now, if you do have some legacy components in the system, the kit is not designed to only work with eARC. You can also use it with ARC as well. This is especially helpful if the system has any legacy equipment, such as an AVR, preamp, or audio processor. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the kit does not downmix the audio. So in other words, if the signal is 5.1 or 7.1, the kit's not going to downmix that audio to 2-channel. This means you may have to go into the TV settings just like before and specifically set the output to 2-channel. Basically, what goes in is what comes out. If you're using the TV's internal speakers, the output's not going to work. So in some cases, you may have to turn off the TV's internal speakers. Every TV is a little bit different, so go ahead and check the manual and see what's going to work best for your situation. Now let's take a closer look at the hardware. First, we'll take a look at the transmitter. If we're looking from left to right, the first connection you see will be an HDMI output. Next to that is the eARC input, which will come from the display. Next to that is an RJ45 jack. This is where the category cable will plug in to send signals over to the receiver. Next is the audio input, which can be 3.5mm analog or mini toslink. The next two connections on the transmitter are the IR in and the IR out. You can use IR emitters and receivers to control devices that might not be in the same room. Or next to that, there's a 3-pin Phoenix connector if you prefer to use RS-232 for control. Next is the power connector for the 12-volt power supply that comes with the kit. Now let's move over to the receiver. First, you have the eARC out or the HDMI output. This is where you connect a soundbar, AVR, or audio processor or preamp, so the eARC signal that came from the transmitter can now be connected. Next to that is the AP-Link, which again is AVPro's proprietary technology. And that's where you connect the category cable, the other end of the cable, of course, being in the transmitter. Next to that is a left-right analog or mini toslink output, then an input and an output for IR signals, or a 3-pin Phoenix connector if you prefer RS-232. Last but not least is where you would connect the 12-volt power supply. On the back of the receiver, you'll see a series of dip switches with a printed guide that will show you how to configure the receiver for your specific needs. The DeARC-KIT supports many different audio formats, all the way from PCM 2-channel to Dolby to DTS and everything in between. Now let's take a look at some of the common uses for the DeARC-KIT. In this example, there's a display which actually acts like a source because remember, we're using the internal apps for streaming. First, you would take an HDMI cable, connect it to the ARC or eARC port on the display, then connect to the eARC input on the transmitter. Next, we're going to take an RJ45 cable and we're going to connect that from the transmitter over to the receiver. Then we have the eARC or HDMI output, which then connects to an AVR, preamp, or processor. In other words, all of the audio coming from the internal apps on the display will go into the transmitter, then to the receiver, and then output to an AVR. What's also great, depending on the installation, you can also take that audio stream from the output on the receiver and connect that to a distributed audio system. Now we're taking the audio from the display, we're routing it over to an AVR, and we're routing it over to a distributed audio system. So for example, let's say you're watching sports on the display, and you want the audio to be both in the room that the display is in, and send it out through the rest of the system. So you're watching sports on the display, you're hearing it in the room, and you're hearing it throughout the rest of the system. Here's another way to look at it. Let's take the same scenario. You're watching sports on this display through one of the streaming apps, and in this case, the display has a Toslink output. So what we would do here is take a Toslink cable from the TV's output over to the input on the transmitter. Now keep in mind, if it is Toslink, you'll need some sort of adapter to go from the regular size Toslink down to mini Toslink. Once the audio connection is made, just like before, we'll have a category cable connecting the transmitter over to the receiver. From here, we can use a mini Toslink cable, come out of the receiver, and then into an AVR. This kit is not solely designed for ARC and eARC signals. As you can see, you can extend Toslink or even analog audio. Let's take a look at something similar, but now we're going to look at analog audio instead of digital. In this particular example, we have a record player. The left-right analog from the record player will go at 3.5 millimeter into the transmitter, category cable from the transmitter over to the receiver, and a 3.5 millimeter analog output over to an amplifier, AVR, or distributed audio. Just keep in mind, anytime a record player is involved, there has to be some sort of phono preamp. In a lot of cases, that's built into the record player, but if not, you could connect the record player to the phono preamp and then into the transmitter. This way you can hear that sweet, warm sound of vinyl throughout the entire system. In this example, we have an older display that only has a Toslink output, and we have a record player with a preamp built in, but we want to get that audio over to an AVR that's either local to that room or powering speakers in another room, or multiple other rooms. Very similar to before, Toslink output from the display to the mini Toslink input on the transmitter. The transmitter is going to send signal over to the receiver, and then we'll simply use the HDMI output on the receiver to plug into the AVR. Or again, we can take the record player with a preamp built in, or any audio source that's analog 2-channel left and right, and instead of Toslink like we used on the TV, we'll use a traditional 3.5 millimeter analog cable. A lot of analog audio sources have a traditional left-right analog RCA connection. The transmitter has a 3.5 millimeter analog connection, so you may need a cable that adapts from left-right analog audio to 3.5 millimeter. Let's now take a look at two different systems. The system on the left, we have a display playing the TV's internal apps, and that's going to connect to the transmitter. So using an HDMI cable, we'll connect the eARC port on the display to the eARC input on the transmitter. Then we have a category cable going over to the receiver, and the HDMI output, which again is also eARC, will connect to an eARC port on the AV receiver. On the example on the right, similar to before, but in this case we have a legacy AVR that doesn't use ARC or eARC, it just has a regular HDMI input. It's very similar to before. We'll connect an HDMI cable from the eARC port of the display into the eARC input on the transmitter, category cable over to the receiver, HDMI output on the receiver, over to an HDMI input on this AVR. One of the special things about this kit is it's so versatile. Whether you have a system with all new components, older components, or a mix of new and old, you can use the DeARC kit to extend those audio signals. And just like every other AVPro Edge product, the DeARC kit comes with a 10-year no BS warranty. You as the integrator and your clients will have the peace of mind knowing that you bought a product that's built to last. And if there are any issues, we'll provide you with top-notch technical support and customer service. If you have any questions about the kit, feel free to give us a call at 605-274-6055. Visit AVProEdge.com to see the DeARC kit's full specifications and features, or if you have specific questions, you can always email us at info@avproedge.com. Now let's take a look at a hands-on demonstration. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at the most common use case for the DeARC kit. Many people today use the TV's internal apps for streaming their favorite movies, TV shows, or even sports. Right now we're watching a video from YouTube. In this particular installation, there's a local soundbar in the same room as the TV, but there's also an AVR powering speakers in a completely different room. Before the DeARC kit, there was not an easy way to hear the audio on both the soundbar and the AVR simultaneously. Today we're going to take a look at how you can send ARC or eARC signals to both. First, take an HDMI cable, connect it to the eARC port on the display, and then to the eARC input on the transmitter. And then a category cable from the transmitter over to the receiver. If sending control signals, in this case IR, plug the IR receiver into the IR input. And then last but not least, power. You do only have to power one side, either the transmitter or the receiver. The HDMI audio output will connect to the HDMI input on the soundbar. On the receiver end, connect the category cable to the AP link port on the receiver, and also an HDMI cable to the audio output. If sending control signals, in this case infrared, connect the IR receiver into the IR output. And because the kit's powered on the transmitter side, there's no need to connect anything to the power port. Now take the other end of the HDMI cable that's plugged into the HDMI output on the receiver into the ARC or eARC port on the AVR or the preamp. Now that all the connections are made, go ahead and turn up the volume on the soundbar.
lot of installers over the last 6 years, basically, is that video distribution is becoming hard.
Now turn the audio up on the preamp, and you'll hear audio coming from both the soundbar that's local to the TV and this pair of speakers that are potentially in a different room.
What is the problem and the solution?
And because we installed the IR receiver and transmitter and routed those signals through the extender kit, we can now control this Blu-ray player with the remote, even though it's in a different room.
To an audio system, like the entire sources. Audio sources from different areas throughout your entire installation back to the heading where they can now be distributed.
And that's how easy it is to set up the DeARC kit. Now you may be wondering, in the video, why is there a turntable over here? Another great use case for the DeARC kit is taking a local digital or analog audio source that's in the same room as the TV or the soundbar, and also sending that audio to both simultaneously. Since this example is a record player, connect the analog output from the player to the transmitter's input with a 3.5mm cable. Just a note, if you are using a turntable, make sure it has a preamplifier built in, or you'll have to install a preamplifier between the record player and the transmitter. Then the last step is to configure the dip switches on the back of the transmitter and receiver to hear the analog or digital input. And in this case, it's analog because we're listening to a record. Go ahead and play the record. And now we'll hear the audio from the record player on both the soundbar and the audio system.